Plato's dialogues were written during the 4th century BC. Now, many of the ideas that Plato presents are put into the mouth of his teacher Socrates. And Socrates was forced to drink poison, to drink hemlock, in 399 BC. Some of these dialogues, and this particular dialogue, the Republic, are part of that tradition in Plato where Plato is trying to explain why Socrates died. The death of Socrates is one of these dramatic moments in history, a little bit like the death of Christ. And the records that we have about the death of Socrates are generally written by his friends, specifically by Plato and by Xenophon. So we don't have an authentic, accurate record of precisely why Socrates was brought to trial and why he was forced to drink hemlock, forced to drink poison. So the information that we get from Plato pretty well exonerates him. It makes him into a sort of saint or martyr. Now, at the time of Socrates' death, the Athenians were just coming out of a nasty war with Sparta. And certainly I lived for a short while in Sparta. It was then quite a small town. Now it's much bigger. We know of Sparta perhaps because of the film 300. I remember when I was travelling to Sparta for the first time, I was given advice by my tutor in Oxford who said, yes, the Spartans didn't build anything except for their bodies. Not entirely true. There are ruins around Sparta, not very many, but there are ruins. Now, it seems that Socrates was really quite impressed by the Spartan way of life. Socrates' enthusiasm for Sparta, whether it's there or not, is made so much worse by his friendship with Alcibiades. Alcibiades appears rather dramatically at the end of the symposium. He's a good-looking rogue who has defected from Athens to Sparta during the Peloponnesian War. He then comes back to Athens. So his loyalty is very suspect. Anybody associated with him must equally be suspect. And at the point when he is killed, the Spartans have defeated Athens. Athens has emerged from a series of fairly dodgy governments. The last one, the government of the 30 tyrants. One of the leaders of that was a former pupil of Socrates, Critias. And Socrates came very close to execution under the 30 tyrants because he refused to hand over or to participate in the execution of Leon of Salamis. Socrates finds himself again on trial, and this time charged with corrupting the youth and impiety. Again, we can pause for 1 second and look at the role of religion in the ancient world. Today we think of religion as something separate, something we do on a Sunday or a Saturday or a Friday. For the ancient world, religion was more like an insurance policy. You see it very nicely in sections of the Old Testament, particularly in 1 and 2 Kings. If the Jewish state has a problem, if it's attacked, if there's a disease, people look around and they say, well, who was responsible? Who's been doing what is evil in the sight of the Lord? Generally, they decide that something dodgy has been happening in the king's palace, so the king is responsible. In the same way, if you go over to Carthage, you will find similar ideas linked to child sacrifice. If the city is attacked, if the city is under threat, we must therefore do something extra to appease the gods to keep them happy. If we make a sacrifice of our grain, if that's not enough, then we must start making a sacrifice of our children. So you will find, when you go over there, these little graves of girls who've been sacrificed to the goddess Tanit. So religion is an insurance policy. It's not really about your belief. It's about making sure that the whole of the city has taken out that insurance policy. So if one person runs around the place and creates new gods or doesn't respect the gods that are there, this means the city itself is potentially under threat. Therefore, religion is not a personal issue. Religion is a state issue. If you've got somebody who is threatening your state, i.e., by not obeying the proper religious processes, then that person deserves to die. On the face of it, that seems to be what happened to Socrates. Socrates talks. We know from evidence in Plato, from the Symposium, that he spends a lot of time talking to his demon, to his personal spirit, who gives him advice. This could be seen as a threat to the state religion. One of the two charges that Socrates is accused of is impiety, and there, part of that is that he invented new gods and that he didn't respect the gods that were already there. So the trial itself is recorded by Socrates' friends, and as I say, like the trial of Jesus, it's the record we've got is fairly suspect. It could be taken as a whitewash of a real event. Contemporary accounts suggest that Socrates was a sophist. Sophist from the Greek word sophia, for wisdom. But it's not a positive word. A sophist was a teacher who went around teaching rhetoric. Rhetoric was terribly important for the ancient Greeks. For example, if I wanted to convince somebody in a law court that I was innocent, I would need a fairly good understanding of rhetoric in order to convince the dicasts, the jurors, of my innocence. Speaking in public was a necessary art, a necessary thing that any educated man in Athens would be able to do. The Sophists were particularly good at playing around with words to convince, for example, their hearers that black is white or white is black. They were wordsmiths. Now, in the contemporary records that we've got, not Plato or Xenophon, who have their own axe to grind, and they are almost writing hagiography. They're almost writing the story of the saint Socrates. But if we look instead at the writings of Aristophanes, where Socrates is presented as a character in the play The Clouds, he's presented as a little bit of a buffoon, and it's clear from that presentation that the general opinion was that he was one of the Sophists. Socrates, however, says Plato, says his student, Socrates was not interested in sophistry. And indeed, Plato's dialogues go a long way to demonstrate that Socrates was opposed to the Sophists. A number of the dialogues are dialogues with well-known Sophists, and these are crushed by the brilliance of Socrates' dialogue. Socrates, instead, is not interested in winning an argument and proving something absurd. Socrates is interested, says Plato, in discovering the truth. And the starting point for that discovery of the truth is recognizing that I myself do not know. That together, you and I, in dialogue, might be able to find a solution, might be able to get to the point where we can establish the truth by asking questions. Clearly, Socrates irritated the temporary government of the day, maybe with a story about an oracle and Socrates himself is the only wise person in Athens and everybody else thinks that they're wise and are proven to be ridiculous, while Socrates runs around the place saying, well, I know nothing, and is proven to be absolutely correct. And then later on discovers, well, in fact, I know a little bit more than you, therefore he indeed is the most wise. Socrates seems to have been in conflict with the Athenian government of the day. Certainly he had a reputation for insubordination because of his clash with the 30 tyrants. But also, if we look at the Republic, it's quite clear that Socrates had very little time for what today we would call democracy, what indeed then was called democracy. But in the Republic, it's made very clear that democracy is a bad thing. Democracy is rule by the mob. What Plato proposes as a better form of government in the Republic is rule by the well-educated philosopher king. Rule by the best. Somebody who is not obsessed with his own or her own self-interest. Incidentally, you could follow this and make a very good case for women being among the philosopher kings. At Socrates' trial, Socrates apparently suggests that the appropriate punishment that he should be given is a stipend by the state, is money. This is, of course, rank insubordination. And we should not be surprised that he is then offered instead the opportunity to kill himself. Whether this, the actual trial that we're shown in either Xenophon or in Plato is true is, in a way, neither here nor there. It does make a terribly good story. It's a very gripping yarn. A little bit, as I say, like the trial and execution of Jesus. The purpose of the writers, both the writers about Plato and the writers about Jesus, is to establish a sort of hagiography, is to establish the importance of the central character, not necessarily to write a thoroughly accurate and watertight description of the trial. And this again is something else which occurs in ancient literature. Very often, in order to convince us that what somebody is saying is really important and really true, we'll put it into the mouth of somebody else that we respect. When we were small children, in order to convince our mother that what we were saying was absolutely true, we'd say, well, my teacher said such and such, or my older brother said such and such. And your mother, obviously, much respecting the teacher or the older brother, might actually accept this absurd statement. The same thing is absolutely true in ancient writings, and we find huge numbers of writings which are attributed to people long dead. This was quite a routine process. So the idea that Plato should be taking the character of his dead teacher and putting him into dialogue after dialogue is not that surprising. What is interesting is how that dead teacher starts to develop a philosophy which is a long way, I think, from the philosophy of the historical Socrates. Xenophon and Plato in the Apology and in the Crito are both in agreement that in the process of the trial and the days leading up to the execution, Socrates was given the opportunity to go into exile, to escape. He rejects this. He says that actually, if he escaped, then those friends who helped him escape would also be liable to come into trial. His main reason for accepting the death sentence, however, is that a philosopher should have no fear of death. The philosopher is looking beyond this life to something which is true and unchanging. He also adds that he would get on no better elsewhere, because wherever he went, he would end up questioning the authority figures and finding himself in trouble, just as he had in Athens. Socrates' death is recorded in the dialogue The Phaedo, and after drinking the poison, he finds that his legs go numb, and he lies down, and gradually the rest of his body goes numb, and just before he's about to die, he says to Crito, do remember to pay the rooster to the god Asclepius Don't forget our debt. Now, what does he mean by that? Because Asclepius is the god of medicine. You would normally give the god a rooster if you've got well. So death doesn't seem to be an automatic reason for giving a rooster to the god. Two possible interpretations of this. Number one, that Socrates saw death as a cure for life, as a release for the soul from the tyranny of the body. Number two is that Socrates saw his death as a remedy for the malady that was afflicting the city of Athens. So with his death, the city is given greater stability. Remember, one of the reasons that Socrates has said that it's worthwhile him dying is that he is a member of this city. He has accepted membership of the city and therefore the law of the city. If at this point the law of the city turns against him and says, you must kill yourself, well, as a good citizen, that's exactly what he should do. Let's turn now to a short bit of film that I made a few years ago, which looks in detail at the allegory of the cave. In the next lesson, we will try to look a little bit more about Plato's ideas of education, and particularly we will look at the allegory of the cave in the context of the Meno and in the context of the divided line and the sun. But for now, let's look at the cave. So Book 7 of the Republic gives us Plato's cave. And this is one of the most famous images in all of philosophy. And it has to be understood in the context of the two other images which came before it, the sun and the divided line. And the divided line is particularly important because that gives us the distinction between what we can understand, episteme, and what we see, the illusions, the doxa. We go into that in more detail when we're looking at the divided line. Now, the story of the cave is told to Glaucon, and Glaucon is one of the more sympathetic pupils of Socrates. He's actually Plato's brother, and as Plato goes through life with the nickname the Broad, in my images, of course, I think of that as a sort of public schoolboy joke. He's not at all broad, he's got no shoulders. Glaucon is owl-eyed. In today's imagery, he'd probably be wearing glasses. There we are. We need to bear in mind all the time that this story is told by Plato in the context of education, specifically the education of a guardian. The story begins with a simple proposition.
Ithi ga anthropus ion en kategio ikisi
Spili o thee. Prisoners are kept facing a wall. They are bound by the feet and the neck so they cannot look round. Behind them are steps leading to the outside world which they cannot see, and above this is a giant fire. By the light of this fire they can see their own shadows. Now, there's a road or a walkway in front of this fire, along which are moved objects or puppets, and these cast an image on the wall that the prisoners mistake for reality. There are also echoes, which the prisoners believe are the voices of the shadows. It's a sort of primitive cinema. And this is an ancient version of the Charygiosis shadow play, which still goes on in Greece today. Puppetry, after all, is an old art. So, let's imagine, says Socrates, that one of these prisoners is released. This is a strictly passive operation. The prisoner is bewitched by the shadows in the cave on the walls and has no desire to change at all. He is dragged out. Two things are important. Firstly, the prisoner is loosened, is released. The word is lysis. In Erasmian Greek, lusis. It's from the verb, the first verb you probably learn if you learn Greek, luo, luis, lui. And it becomes a technical term in Neoplatonism, and Neoplatonism underpins the developments in Judaism in the 1st century and the development of early Christianity. The second point is the prisoner is made to turn round. He's not just led out, he's made to turn round. The Greek word is periagon. He's made to examine his life. The unexamined life is not worth living. And finally, the third word, which needs emphasis, is physi. In 515c, it sounds a little scatological, but it means nature. And a rough translation is, in the course of nature, someone is released, someone is loosened. It's natural. It's natural to be educated. This is what Plato is saying, that the process of release from the cave is natural, that it's unnatural to be in the cave. The prisoner is led out, led up, dragged out by someone else. He's the passive agent in this story. But, of course, at the end of the story, he becomes the active agent because education confers responsibility. So, let's put all this together. The prisoner has been released. He's been dragged out of the cave. He's ascended up into the light. First he sees the fire, and he sees the puppeteers, then he sees the cave mouth and the steps, and he goes up, and his eyes cannot adjust to the light of the sun. So first he spends his time looking at reflections, and looking in the water, and looking at the night sky, until finally his eyes have adjusted and he can approach the sun. And once he's got that moment of enlightenment, he feels impelled to go back into the cave and tell everybody else. And here the story changes slightly, and we get an allegory of the life of Socrates himself, the person who goes back into the cave and tries to convince these prisoners who are bewitched by their primitive shadow play, by their primitive cinema, the person who tries to convince them that this is not the truth, that the truth is out there, the other prisoners will turn on him and kill him, as indeed Socrates was forced to drink hemlock and to die.